This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 516, entitled, "What Will Life Be Like for Fluffies and Fluffie Feminists when millions of masculists hate them?" Question mark. Description. This flyer imagines how life will be like for fluffies and fluffy feminists about a decade or so from now, when there are millions of masculists who to push hard for the biconsciousing of the planet, converting monoconscious feminists to be biconscious or be dumped, getting biconsciousness into the media and the parliaments, etc. It will be a world that will please the masculists. The flyer itself. What will life be like for fluffies and fluffy feminists when millions of masculists hate them? By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In short, pretty miserable. This flyer looks a bit into the future when there are millions of masculists who publicly express their hatred of fluffy manslavers and fluffy feminist hypocrite genociders. What will life be like for these two groups of women once they feel the masculist hatred of them, coming from all sides, from their ex-boyfriends, their male colleagues, males in their audiences, etc.? As a masculist who's trying to spread masculist ideas and masculist rhetoric so that several billion men can be liberated from decades of manslavery at the hands of their fluffy parasite wives, it's very encouraging to learn from sociological research that one only has to convert the smartest 10% of the population to a new cause for the rest of humanity to follow along, listening to the opinions of the top 10%. The large majority of the population is not smart enough to have original opinions, in brackets, a simple consequence of the IQ bell curve. So depend on the intellectual leaders to provide them their opinions, and then they follow the leaders. So all the masculists need to do is convert this top 10% to masculist thinking, using powerful masculist arguments so that the masculists carry the day. Since with the top 10% of the population favourable to masculist thinking, the herd will then follow, as herds always do. So let's jump a few years into the future, assuming that masculist ideas have spread far and wide, that most young men have absorbed masculist thinking and masculist values into their psyches and lifestyles, expressing their masculist hatred of fluffies and fluffy feminists whenever they come across such women. So what will life be like for these two groups of women who are the primary enemies of the masculists, who masculists aim to exterminate by forcing such women to rot on the shelf, utterly rejected by masculisted men, who see such women as hateable manslavers and hypocritical genociders, respectively? At the moment, writing this in April of 2022, the masculists are at the stage of having only one or several masculists in a room in which a public talk is given. What impact will a sizable group, say a dozen masculists in a room, have on the audience when they start haranguing some monoconscious feminist speaker at a meeting? Question mark. Obviously, they will be very effective since 1, they are male, so on average will be smarter than the females, and 2, they will be a lot more aggressive And 3, since they'll be intellectually armed with masculist rhetoric and masculist arguments, they'll be able to conquer most feminist arguments, since many feminist arguments are based on wishful thinking rather than on science, whereas masculist ideas are much more science-based, so are much less refutable. If some monoconscious feminist starts telling her audience how much women are victims of men's aggression, chauvinism, etc., then the masculist group can stand up, reinforcing each other, and start preaching to the audience that in fact women oppress men far worse, since many of women's gender crimes against men last decades, so are hugely more significant than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women that the feminists have been harping on for the past 6 decades of their gender political monopoly. This group of intellectually armed masculists can tell the audience that this decade is men's decade, the decade in which men get masculisted, have their masculist consciousness raised, so that they see that fluffydom is manslavery, and that manslavery is slavery, and a far greater gender crime against men by women than even rape is against women by men. A woman who manslaves a man for decades of his life commits a far greater gender crime against him than him raping her. Far greater. This group of masculists can tell the audience of the massive gender crimes committed daily in the hated fluffy feminist controlled divorce courts, where one father in 4 gets financially massacred and has his life ruined. This masculist group can tell the audience that the take-home message from this talk is not what the feminists had to say, which will be old hat after 6 decades of feminist gender political monopoly, but that women, feminists, no longer have a monopoly over gender politics that they have had for 6 decades, that they will be forced by the masculists to share the gender political stage with them. And furthermore, since the masculists are men, they will quickly dominate that stage, the way men dominate everything. Since women, with their 10% smaller brains and their 10 times lower testosterone levels, cannot compete with men at the top end of the performance scale. Sooner or later, journalists in these audiences will pick up on these masculist arguments and start reporting on them in their media, thus spreading masculist ideas to the masses, the millions, thus accelerating the conversion of the top 10% of the smartest people in the population to masculist thinking. Once there are millions of masculists, then the whole dynamics of woman-man relationships will fundamentally change. Monoconscious feminists will no longer be able to browbeat their boyfriends with the way that men oppress women, since the boyfriend is now assumed to be a biconscious masculist, who has learned masculist ideas and has the intellectual tools not only to answer back to his monoconscious feminist girlfriend, but to crush her in gender political terms if he chooses to, but it might cost him the loss of his monoconscious girlfriend. If he likes his woman, but gets annoyed at her bigoted monoconsciousness, then he can choose a strategy of softly, feeding her masculist ideas so that over time she gradually absorbs masculist ideas and becomes aware how women oppress men, and in fact worse than vice versa. He can teach her about what happens to one father in 4 in the hated fluffy feminist controlled divorce court system. He can tell her that she, as a woman, has the MARA, the maternity rejection right, but he does not have the PARA, the paternity rejection right, which is the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists, and it's not against women, but against men. He can tell her that it was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women science-based medicine, a life expectancy of 85 years, the pill, household gadgets, higher education, so that women now can work. So women must work, say the masculists, or be considered hated manslavers, to be wiped out by being totally ignored by men, forced to rot on the shelf as hated manslavers. He can tell her that the masculists want gender equality committees, that's GECs, G-E-Cs, in the parliaments, that consists half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally, which is certainly not the case today, and is another blatant form of sexual discrimination against men. Since monoconscious feminists know nothing of masculine ideas, by definition, they suffer the delusion that it's only women who suffer from their gender role. The biconscious boyfriend can teach his monoconscious feminist girlfriend that that delusion is just that and should be gotten rid of by her becoming biconscious, by learning masculine ideas, that she loses her feminazi bitchiness, her anger at men, since the only gender politics she knows is feminist, which teaches her that men oppress women and tells her nothing about the reverse case, which has to come from her biconscious boyfriend. If she has a rather rigid, dogmatic mind, then it's quite possible that she may suffer cognitive dissonance and reject the masculine teachings of her biconscious boyfriend and start to feel very threatened by him, since to her, her feminism is rather like a modern-day religion to her, her core value system, and the way she interprets the world. This is the end of part 1.